Okay, still a lot of people here. With Frank, we prepare some jokes, but we hope you guys gonna enjoy our jokes. It's a bit difficult for us today to share this session, the final but very important plenary session. Maybe you should stand alongside me. We both from the School of Public Policy. He is the non-resident professor at the School of Public Policy, Chiang Mai University. I'm the associate professor here. And we're gonna lead the discussion that gonna talking about the big elephants in the room. And those elephants is not only stand in the room, but they also kick the door and kick the wall and destroy the room. So it's very, very, it's first time that I feel a bit worried about my future of my career. But I hope we're gonna be okay. So you're gonna be with me and take full responsible about the discussion that we're gonna lead. So today we have 3 panelists. I need to check to ensure that I make a correct introduction about their background. So we have Eduardo, Viola. He is the professor at the University of Sao Paulo with the expertise of climate governance and policies in democratic and weak democratic countries. He has served as the member of various climate-related international committee, having a lot of insights involved in most of the evolution of this topic. We have a chance to discuss many times during the conference, so he can share a lot of things, and you guys can have, it's a good chance for you to raise the question directly to him. He was one of the very first people who advocate for protecting the Amazon from the political economy perspective. His recent books, the first one, Building Capability for Earth System Governance, and the Climate Change and Biodiversity Governance in the Amazon. Okay. The second, we have Christian Downie. He is the professor at the Australia National University, ANU. Here, he served as the director of the Governing Energy Transition Lab under the School of Regulation and Global Governance. He also worked as the consultant for many Australian government agencies, including the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment, and Water. His important book is Business Battle in the US Energy Section and the Politics of Climate Change Negotiations. Apart from that, he is truly the public intellectual who gave his opinion to a lot of media, such as ABC, CNN, and The Guardian. Last but not least, we also have Dieter Plewhe. He is a senior fellow at the Berlin Social Science Center's research group on globalization work and production. He is also a lecturer in the political science at the University of Kassel. He is known for his work on the think tank networks and controversy around energy transition and green capitalism. He leads the global survey group of the Climate Social Science Network and served as the forum editor of the Critical Policy Study journal. His recent work is Market Civilization, Neoliberals, East and South. Okay, to help set the stage for the discussion today, I will now hand over to Frank for the introduction note. Okay.
Thank you, Piapong. I just will say a few words about climate change to establish a context for the presentations that will follow. I think it's increasingly common these days to say that the climate crisis is an existential crisis of our time. We used to say that it's coming, but now we have to say that it's here, certainly for many people around the world, especially those now living with extreme heat waves and devastating forest fires. I had to kind of laugh when I was coming here the first day. I was in the car with an Italian colleague, and he said how ironic it is that I have to come to Thailand to cool down from Italy. Things are not what they used to be. It's fair to say we've failed to rise to the occasion. There is no ecological strategy that credibly takes on this enormous challenge. The prominent German sociologist Ulrich Beck spoke of the public and its representatives as taking a fatalist position, sticking their heads in the sand, even though survival of our way of life, as we have known it, has raised its head. Some would say hangs in the balance. Despite regular warnings from climate scientists, the crisis challenges our ability to respond politically and cognitively. When I started my career, we thought naively that social science and public policy could help to guide our way to a just and sustainable future. But this was too optimistic. The environmentalism we sought to advise and support moved in the corridors of power from citizen engagement to technocratic policymaking before it became challenged by populist post-truth politics, climate denialism, and the rejection of science and expertise by large numbers of people. We used to argue that democracy and citizen participation were key to a sustainable strategy, but if I may modestly say so, in my book, Climate Crisis and the Democratic Process, I discuss that the ways in which we now face new anti-democratic, anti-science, authoritarian challenges. Some say democracy has failed on climate change and that we need a strong hand, either technocratic governance or some sort of ecological dictatorship. Now, many, including powerful politicians in the most polluting countries, deny climate crisis and say it's fake news. Moreover, they have helped to develop and facilitate influential groups, often relatively hidden, to organize manipulative campaigns against climate policies. Here, on the Roundtable, we want to uncover and explore these forms of obstruction, denial, and political strategies behind these nefarious efforts. Plewhe has introduced the speakers, so I will just now turn it over to Eduardo.
Okay, Thank you very much, Frank, Dieter, because of the invitation to participate here. This is my first time in the IPA. I am frequent presenter at the International Studies Association and the International Political Science Association. But this is my first time here. It's very interesting. I have learned a lot in plenaries and panels. And so I will try to convey the message that according to the invitation. It's not easy because it's not a significant amount of time that I have. So the idea, they invited me because of a book that is going to be published in September, that I am one of the authors of one of the chapters, co-author of the chapter that is about obstructionism in climate change. It's a subject is not as well researched as others in climate change, in the political economy of climate change, and particularly my chapter is related to obstructionism in the United Nations Framework Conventions on Climate Change, in the negotiations every year, and the IPCC. Okay, so the title, Major Powers Slowing Down and Obstructing Climate Action, Fundamentals, so this is very important, okay, COP's negotiation and IPCC, because in order to understand the dynamic of obstruction in the negotiation, it's key to take a look as deep as possible in the fundamentals, political economy of fundamentals. That is a lot to do with share of global carbon emissions and per capita emissions in order to know exactly what is a just transition to a low carbon economy. Next, please. Okay, some very fast recent developments in climate change. Okay, first, climate change is accelerating faster than prediction of the 6th report of the IPCC, being 21-22. 23 and 24, the hottest year in 120,000 years. Okay? Renewable energy, particularly solar, is growing very fast, but fossil fuels also continues growing significantly. The key to decarbonization is fast growing of renewable, but significant declining of fossil fuels. And this is not happening at all, just in some countries. The top momentum of global climate policy was at COP26, that was in Glasgow 21. 2 months after, there was the invasion of Russia to Ukraine, and this produced a stagnation of global climate policy. So we are in a different kind of momentum that has been accelerated by the election of Trump. What happened? At Glasgow, the mantra was energy transition. This is why I consider the peak, even if not it's a major momentum anyway, but it's the top. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the mantra changed and was much more national security and energy security. The geopolitical confrontation between the US and China that is accelerating strongly impact global climate policy. The European Union don't have any more capacity of effective leadership. The European Union was the leadership in climate policy, global climate policy, since '92. But since 92, because of the threat of Russia, and now this economic threat of Trump, let's say it that way, doesn't have real capacity. The discourse continues yes of the leadership, but the capacity is not there the way it was before. Okay? So now we are living through a vacuum of leadership in the world. And since Trump election in 24, progressive American corporations are slowing down, progressive, or reversing commitment to decarbonization. Next one, please. Okay. Amazingly, China continues considering itself a developing country and constructing coal power plants. This is not very well known, okay? Increased focus in adaptation over mitigation is happening in high-income and high-middle-income countries because of low international cooperation, even if the discourse is not changing. Increasing resentment in low-income and low-middle-income countries against high-income countries, and because of funding, okay? Uncertainty about how acceleration of artificial intelligence will impact. This is a fascinating subject that I don't have any time to enter into. Climate realism is the new movement promoted for conservative forces in many countries. I don't have time to extend about this, but this is very, very recent, okay? Climate realism, okay? Negative perspectives in international climate finance is a major threat to COP30 that will be in Belém in November this year, 25. Sorry for the mistake. Next, please. Okay, this is the question. Is climate change politics and policy making elusive? Okay? It was elusive in the past, but not anymore now because of the increase in frequency and intensity on extreme weather events. Very important. At the time I started to research climate change, late 80s, early 90s, I mean, it was very difficult to communicate to middle citizens what was climate change because it's just it's 0.1 of degree augment in the temperature every decade. Now it's very easy because of the intensity and frequency of extreme climate events. This is a major change in my whole career as a researcher. But the question continues, the subject is extremely controversial. Outside the scientific community, where there is a lot of consensus with some difference. Many dimensions, just mentioning. How urgent is to deal with climate change? What countries are responsible for producing and for decarbonizing? How to interpret the principle of common but differentiated responsibility? A major debate about this, okay? What countries should finance the poor countries? How fast should be the energy transition? Are not natural gas and nuclear legitimate parts of energy transition? Is there space for geoengineering? All questions open, okay? I don't have any time for giving any different scenarios and answers about this. Next, please. So, fundamentals of climate change. Climate powers are key to understand climate obstruction. Climate powers have a significant share of global carbon emission, and some have significant capacity for decarbonization, technological capacity. The most important climate powers are the US, China, the European Union, UK, that we can consider together in this point, and India. The first two are superpowers in all dimensions of power, not the second one, okay? Russia, Brazil, Indonesia, Japan, and Saudi Arabia are a second tier of climate powers. All climate power, except the UK, the European Union, UK, has a consistent history of slowing down or undermining climate action. The position of climate policy in climate power in negotiation generally derives from emissions profile, perceived difficult for decarbonization, and perception of vulnerability to climate change. So it's the way it is defined the national interest. Next one. The US, those are very fast data that are crucial. Data from Climate Watch in this case. Share of global carbon emission, 11.5. Per capita, almost 17 tons per capita. National determined contribution, defined by climate tracker, that is more prestigious in defining more through some criteria what is the how sound is the national determined contribution, is insufficient. There is a category that is critically insufficient, very insufficient, insufficient, and almost sufficient. Okay, this is likely will be critically insufficient in 2025 because of Trump. Engaging and withdraw, the US has a history of ups and downs, engaging and withdrawing. The first climate policy in the US was United States, Biden 22, that is being destroyed right now by the Trump administration. Emissions started to decline in 2008, but not because of climate policy, because of the shale gas revolution. Since 21, emissions have grown again. Very interesting. Kamala Harris, in 24, in the electoral campaign, has a discourse strongly in favor of oil and gas, different from Biden in 2020. Okay? This says a lot about the evolution of the American mindset. American position has got predominantly conservative, very influenced by fossil fuel corporations. Next one. China emitted more than 50% of global carbon emissions in the period 2019. 22 is 26% share of global carbon emissions, per capita 9 tons, and NDC highly insufficient. China extremely non-cooperative in negotiation between 92 and 2013. Paris Agreement was possible because it was a short window of convergence between the European Union, the US, and China. In the second half of 2010, China became the major world exporter of renewable energy equipment and electric vehicles. In 24, China continues building coal-feed thermal power plants, a lot, okay? And its energy matrix is more than 75% fossil. China continues considering itself a developing country with no obligation of funding poor countries, far away from reality. Okay? Next, European Union, United Kingdom was the vanguard. Share 7.1 is declining significantly over the last 20 years. Per capita 7.2 tons. For example, the European Union has a per capita lower than China today. Okay? And NDC insufficient. The carbon market of the European Union is the only one robust in the world, oscillating between 60 and 90 euros the ton of carbon. The European Union UK is the only political unit that keeps the baseline of climate commitment in 1990, according to the Rio Convention and Kyoto Protocol. All the other countries changed, okay? So this is amazing, anyway. Next one. India, Russia, Japan. India is one of the fastest growing countries in carbon emission, share 7.7, global per capita emissions, very low, less than 3, okay? But NDC is highly insufficient, okay? It has been less cooperative in negotiations, always trying to interpret the principle of common but differentiation of responsibilities in a radical way. Russia shared 375, per capita almost 13 tons. NDC critically insufficient, the worst of all, okay? Russia has been always a predator of the climate regime. It has never had effective climate policy. More recently, Russia considered the climate regime as a threat to national security. Japan shared 2.15 per capita, 834 tons, insufficient, conservative position in most COPs, high-tech capacities. Next one, I will try to accelerate because Brazil shared 3.2, per capita 7.3, insufficient. Basically, the policy of Brazil oscillates according to land use change, okay, and deforestation. This is the key problem of Brazil, that has changed a lot, okay? During the third Lula administration, now there is a contradictory policy. Significant reduction of deforestation, very good, but increase in production and export of oil. Okay? It's becoming a major global oil export, Brazil. Okay? Indonesia, 3.155 tons per capita, critically insufficient. It's similar to Brazil because of the importance of deforestation, but very low profile in negotiations. Okay? Saudi Arabia share 1.7, per capita 24 tons, okay? Critically insufficient, major obstructor of climate negotiation and IPCC, leader of OPEC countries. Next one. IPCC. The IPCC generally don't do new research, but evaluate the science that has been produced globally since the previous report. Members of IPCC are appointed by governments and international organizations. In democratic countries, many scientific associations participate in selection of members. In autocratic countries, the process is top-down. This is very important to consider. I don't have time to elaborate about this, of course. The Bureau, a body elected by the full IPCC panel of 195 members government, is responsible for selecting which scientists will fill the key author and editor roles. This is a very important position. As in most organizations, there is much politics in the IPCC. Okay? They produce the executive report and the executive ceremony. The executive ceremony is where there is a lot of politics. Okay? The scientific report that is 3,000–4,000 pages is less contaminated by politics. Next one. Procedural obstruction as COPs and IPCC. Procedural obstruction, slowing down or degrading negotiation, abusing rules of procedures like speaking frequently, repeating the same argument, assuming key positions in the conference. For example, the OPEC countries assuming frequently the leadership of G77, limiting the scope of an issue or considering convenient. In the IPCC, obstructionist countries had used frequently procedural obstruction. In autocratic countries, the scientists, members of the IPCC, follow the policy assumed by the government and frequently operate as agents of state power, different than democratic countries in which the scientists are relatively, but not completely in many cases, independent from governments. Next. Substantial obstructions. Target substance of the negotiation, preventing an issue to be in the agenda or manipulating the scoping and meaning. Saudi Arabia, example, defending that climate convention is not an energy convention. This is a very frequent argument of Saudi Arabia, and fossil fuels cannot be touched. Okay? China questioning the 1.5-degree target, general opposition to mention fossil fuel reduction by Saudi Arabia, Russia, China, probably China will change this year. Radical defense of a strong differentiation of responsibility by some developing or emerging countries. High differentiation. Or to the contrary, developed countries, particularly the United States, trying to dilute differentiation. Substantial obstructions in the IPCC undermine the prestige of the institution or some scientists, continuously questioning conclusions of report, bringing reports funded by fossil fuel corporations. Next. Okay, this is for finishing. My opinion about how to promote sound climate policy in difficult times. This is a kind of my view of the world, synthesized somehow. Recognize that we are experiencing a cycle of democratic recession and stagnation of climate policy in the world. What could, sorry, I cannot read. Okay, recognize that and build up defensive strategies appropriated for the conjuncture. Build up wider coalitions, nationally and internationally, for decarbonization. If necessary, paying the price of less ambitious goals. I know that this is controversial, but anyway, this is my view, personal view. Promote viable adaptation strategies at the local and national level. Build up a wide political coalition to defeat the Republican Party in the 2026 and 28 elections. This is key. The fate of climate policy in the world, a lot is connected to the domestic politics of the United States. Okay? unfortunately. Build up wide political coalition to defeat the far right in elections in the most important European countries. Build up a wide coalition from center-right to center-left in Brazil to defeat the far right in 26 elections. Thank you very much.
So from the international and governmental perspective, we're going to move to Christian. He's going to highlight the big business.
Good afternoon, everyone. I promise I didn't take a lot of money from big business to give this talk. Thanks to everybody for being here. It's a pleasure to be part of this session. Also, we just want to thank Pierpont and Frank for convening. So if you look at the climate politics literature, actually if you just look at the climate literature full stop, there's probably two things that stand out. The first one is just the overwhelming body of evidence that the world's heating up. Eduardo's just spoken about the IPCC, but there's a huge amount of scientific knowledge about how much the world is heating. The second thing that really stands out is that we're failing, right? Societies all around the world are failing to adequately respond to the climate crisis. Now, depending on which things you read, there's a whole range of explanations for that. Some people will point to human nature. There's studies talking about democratic deficits, lots of work on the shortcomings of different technologies. And these are all, kind of legitimate factors, but I want to offer a different explanation this afternoon. And that is that one of the main reasons that we're failing, one of the main reasons that the world is actually well on track now for 3 or 4 degrees Celsius, and there's kind of incredible consequences that come with that. But one of the reasons is because of actions that various organisations have taken to delay action on climate change, to slow and block policies. Now, this isn't something that's just based on my own work or based on the work of a handful of scholars. There's now an accumulated body of empirical evidence that shows that actions to obstruct action on climate change and our failure to understand it, to identify it and to overcome it is one of the reasons that we're in the predicament that we are. So, along with my co-authors, Timmins Roberts, Carlos Milani, Jennifer Jacquet, we put together a work. Essentially, it's really, I think, the first kind of global assessment of climate obstruction. So what we've really tried to do is synthesize all the existing knowledge in this space. So this book, which will, obviously you've got to do a book plug when you're up here, right? This book will come out in October by Oxford University Press, but it's a collected work, 110 authors across 30 countries trying to synthesize our knowledge in this space. So I want to draw on it today to talk about 3 questions. What do we mean by climate obstruction? Who's doing it? Who are the actors, the organisations? And how are they going about it? What are their political strategies? So what do we mean by climate obstruction? How do you know it when you see it? Well, perhaps let me give you the most egregious example. For those that work in the climate space, this will be familiar, but for others, perhaps not. Most of you will have heard of the oil and gas company, ExxonMobil. It's the largest publicly listed oil and gas company in the world. It's actually got operations on 6 of the world's 7 continents. But back in the 1960s and 1970s, scientists within ExxonMobil were publishing on this topic in the leading peer-reviewed journals. By the late 1970s, they were warning their executives in their own company that, hey, burning of oil and gas is starting to shift the climate. This is in the 70s. This is more than 50 years ago now. By the 1980s, the executives in this firm knew that climate change represented an existential threat to their profitability. But what we also know, thanks to investigative journalists and several scholars, is that the company didn't respond by going, okay, let's put in place a transition plan over a number of decades to wean off fossil fuels. Instead, what they did is they shut down some of their scientific laboratories within the firm, they silenced some of their scientists, and they spent tens of millions of dollars funding disinformation campaigns and political campaigns to try and obstruct action on climate change. So this is probably a classic case of what we mean by climate obstruction. And in the book, this is how we define it. I won't read it out, but essentially it's about intentional actions to slow or block policies on climate change that are inconsistent with the science. Okay, so that's the first thing about how we understand what climate obstruction is. The second question I want to touch on is who's doing it? Who are the actors? Who are the organisations that are engaged in climate obstruction? Well, one of the key findings is that oil and gas companies, as might not come as a surprise, are key players, but they're also not the only ones. So a lot of the early literature focused on companies like Shell, Total, BP, Conoco, Chevron and others, and the role they've played. And that's quite right. We know a lot about the intentional actions that those firms have done. In fact, really since the 1980s, tens of billions of dollars have been spent by these firms on advertising campaigns, online campaigns, radio, TV, funding kind of fake community groups, commissioning economic reports, consulting reports, all to question the science of climate change, or to try and delay effective action. So oil and gas industry is very much at the centre of the story, but it's not the only ones. Coal industry, utilities, including some of the big utilities in this part of the world. In the transport sector, we have chapters detailing what car manufacturers, airline companies have been doing. Also, thanks to the work of people in this audience, we know a lot about the role of the meat and dairy industry, for example, one of the largest methane emitters in the world. And so that's another industry where we see a lot of action being done in this space. So key takeaway here is it's not just the usual suspects. It's industries right across our economy. And to go to those bottom points there, it's also supply chains. We see coalitions forming in many jurisdictions right across the economy trying to block various climate policies. Peak bodies like chambers of commerce in many countries are doing this, but also industries that you wouldn't normally think of. So take railroads. If someone talked to you about the railroad industry, you're not going to initially think that that's a likely opponent of climate action. But in many countries, the railroad industry, one of its big customers is coal, because they're transporting coal around the economy or around the country. So actually in a lot of countries, the railroad industry as well is involved in some of these efforts. So we're seeing lots of actors right across the economy in many, many countries that are engaged in climate obstruction. The third question then is, how are they doing it? What are their political strategies? What type of networks are engaged in this space? Now, everyone will have heard the Paris Agreement in 2015. This was the large UN agreement that was signed a decade ago to try and keep global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Since pre-industrial levels, we're sadly going to shoot way past that. But in the decades since, what we've actually seen is much less focus on denying the scientific reality of climate change. You don't see that as much by the activities of some of these organisations. What you do see is much more creating doubt about the severity of issue. So you'll see a lot of claims that climate change isn't going to be as bad as some people say, we'll be able to adapt to it, don't worry. That's a kind of big strategy these days. Another one is challenging the viability of solutions, raising question marks about how much we can really rely on solar or wind or other clean energy sources. Are batteries really safe? In my own country, in Australia, if there's ever a battery fire, it's often promoted as a reason that we can never have anything electrified. So you see these types of strategies. Greenwashing is a common one. I'm sure in many countries this is a common strategy. Probably like many of you who flew here, the airline industry is a classic case of this. Actually, last year in the Netherlands, a Dutch court ruled that KLM, the big Dutch airline, had engaged in a greenwashing campaign because the court found that its attempts to promote this fly responsibly campaign just didn't add up. So we're seeing lots of greenwashing. But we're also seeing that these types of misinformation campaigns are really just one part of much more sophisticated influence campaigns. So this is a network or a kind of figure that a colleague of mine in the US, Robert Brull, put together. And really it's an attempt to map out the kind of interconnected networks of organisations that are working in this space. And you can see that it's really an interlocking network of individuals, organisations, media, advertisers, think tanks, universities, lobbyists, foundations and others that are either financed by or influenced in other ways to shape public agendas, media agendas, political agendas, all with a focus on trying to shape policy outcomes. So if we want to understand the role that particularly individuals and corporations are playing in this space, we need to understand these networks. We also need to understand some of these actors that we probably don't talk about as much. And what was really striking when we brought together all this empirical evidence was that there was three key actors that stand out. And so these are trade associations, public relations firms, and think tanks. We talk about them as enablers of climate obstruction, and that's because many firms, what they do is they employ these organisations essentially to do their dirty work. And the word enablers is kind of interesting too. We're seeing political leaders use this as well. Last year, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, gave a speech calling out public relations firms like Edelman, one of the largest in the world, calling out consultancy firms like McKinsey and others, and he called on them, and I quote him here, he called on them to stop acting as enablers of planetary destruction. So we're seeing the head of the UN making these claims now. We're seeing political leaders in the US, sadly not the political leaders that are in power, but you see senators now talking about this in my own country as well. But many of these organisations are key to trying to understand climate obstruction. I'm going to talk a little bit about trade associations because I know Dieter's going to talk about think tanks as well in a moment, which have played a key role. So let me draw a little bit on some work I've been doing with my colleague Robert Brull, trying to understand the role of trade associations. So for those of you that don't work in this space, trade associations are really, they're kind of member-based organisations that firms use to coordinate their political activities. So what we did is we looked at kind of what are the financial resources and the political spending of these types of organisations in the US. Okay, so here on this slide, we have a sample of 90 trade associations. We looked at 90 trade associations in the US that are engaged on climate issues. And you can see here on this figure, they're organised, each colour represents an industry. So this is just us. So what we did, obviously this isn't the place to go through the methods, but we really just went through their tax filings to try and understand their financial resources. And you can see here in purple the oil and gas industry. Over a decade, they had $4.5 billion in revenue. And this is just the trade associations, not the firms. The utility industry, $4+ billion. The transport sector there, that's including aviation, car manufacturers, others, almost $4 billion in revenue. These are industries that typically oppose climate policies. But if you cast your eye down to the bottom corner here in dark blue, that's the renewable sector. That sector like solar, wind, hydro, geothermal, 580 million. So you can see quite quickly that those types of industries that typically oppose climate action are much better resourced, overwhelming financial resources compared to those that might typically stand up and support a carbon price or other policies in any one jurisdiction. So now that we had some understanding of how much financial resources these organisations had at their disposal, the next thing to look at was, well, how much are they spending on politics? How much money are they putting into political activities? I would have thought a large chunk of this money was going into other things like regulatory standards. But actually, in that decade, 2008 to 2018, US $4.6 billion, just this one group of organisations, was spending trying to shape policy outcomes in the US, largely around climate change. So 13% of their revenues. Huge sums of money. For those that are political scientists, we also know that most political work by business groups is done by the firm, and trade associations probably come in second. So if trade associations are spending $4.6 billion US dollars, we know that firms are spending a lot more. So huge sums of money being placed around to try and shape climate policy outcomes. So this is kind of what NGOs and activists in the climate space are really up against when they're thinking about how to get action on climate change. So that was their total revenue, total spending. And I guess the next question is then trying to understand where this money is going. So almost 2/3 of the political spending by these organisations was going on advertising and promotion. I mentioned PR firms in a moment, but almost two-thirds, $2.1 billion was going into money being directed to activities related to public relations, advertising. This is to employ firms like Edelman to do things like polling, run TV campaigns, media campaigns. A lot of these firms also do other things. They'll set up fake community groups, and I can give some examples in the discussion, but that's where some of this money is going. About a quarter went into lobbying, $729 million there, going into kind of more traditional lobbying practices, that is walking down the hallways of Congress and trying to persuade lawmakers of why one policy is better than another. And then the rest of the money was going into grants and political contributions. I think political contributions is kind of interesting because in a lot of countries you'll pick up the newspaper and there'll be a lot of focus on how much money is going to different political parties or different candidates. And $104 million is a lot of money, but in comparison to all the other types of activities, political contributions is actually only a small part of the pie. And then almost $400 million was going into grants. Again, happy to talk more about this in the discussion, but grants, to my surprise really, when we were going through this data, go to so many different organisations. So a group like the American Petroleum Institute, one of the largest trade associations in the US, it represents Exxon and Chevron and BP and Shell, they're giving money to historical societies, museums, local sports groups, community groups. They're funding awards ceremonies at media awards. They're funding universities, etc. So they're putting money into a whole range of organisations right around society. We can talk more about why that might be. I think part of it is to deal with social licence to operate. But these firms, I guess, have their fingers, kind of all around society. Okay, so that's the bad news. There's a lot of money being spent to try and shape policy outcomes around climate change that are very much inconsistent with what climate scientists have been warning us about. The better news is that at the final chapters of the book, we try and have some understanding of what organisations in society are pushing back against this. What are the kind of strategies that different groups are using to address or to counter climate obstruction? And so we see a whole range of tools being used. Litigation under consumer protection and false advertising statutes. We see transparency policies being put in place, kind of classic public campaigns around naming and shaming bad actors. There are plenty of tools that different organisations and policymakers, NGOs, activists, journalists, scholars and others are using. There's a few examples of those organisations at the bottom of the slide there. But one trend which is encouraging is just the work that's going in now by policymakers and lawyers in particular to hold inquiries, to prosecute legal claims, to try and hold some of these corporate actors to account both for their emissions, and we know a lot more about which corporations are contributing different amounts of carbon emissions so they can be held to account in legal courts, but also policymakers holding various political inquiries into this. So a couple of years ago, 2 years ago now, when the Democrats held control of the House of Representatives in the US, there was inquiries into what the oil and gas industry knew about climate change and what they were doing. And in the places like the Philippines in 2022, the Philippines Commission on Human Rights, for example, held an inquiry trying to understand what the oil industry had been doing in this space and whether they were accountable. And very encouragingly, although they don't have necessarily the same power as other organisations in society, the Philippines Commission on Human Rights concluded that several of these companies had engaged, in their words, in climate obstruction. So there are some glimmers of hope out there in this space. Obviously, a lot of these actors are doing a great job trying to push back against the tide of climate obstruction, but plenty more work to be done in this space, including by researchers trying to expose and understand some of these activities. So I'll leave it there. Thanks everyone. I hope you've got a slightly better idea now of what we mean by climate obstruction, who's doing it, how they're doing it. My contact details are there. If you're working in this space or thinking of working in this space, do get in contact, and great to be part of this conference. Thank you.
Yes, Dieter. Then we're going to move to the role of think tanks, which more or less directly relate to us.
Thank you. Let me, before I start? Oh, yeah, there it is. Let me, before I start, also express my deep gratitude for IPPA to have us in this panel, and to the local organizers here in Chiang Mai in particular. It's a great way maybe to start a larger conversation. I think the note on optimism at the end is of course not just optimism, but the recognition we are not just suffering from activities of others. And let me emphasize this with the title of my presentation on one of the groups of actors that are involved in obstructing climate action, obstructing climate movement. And you see that I named it a climate change counter movement, which means that to start with, the fact that we are dealing with climate policy, that we have the Paris Agreement, that we have the IPCC, is actually a result of the climate movement. And so we should, in the first place, be proud that a very, very important political agenda historically has been set up, and that very powerful forces that Christian introduced to some extent here have found it necessary to react in the ways they did. And that, of course, makes it necessary to think about counter movements. And what do counter movements do? They need to know who they are standing up against. And that's what I'm trying in my presentation. We know the puzzle. We have all the scientific base. We have sort of like the claims that we do science-based, evidence-based policies, and yet the results we know are not conforming to this picture. And people have ridiculed the efforts of the counter movement, like the non-governmental International Panel on Climate Change, set up by many think tanks and experts or self-declared experts, that bring out reports exactly at the same time when the IPCC reports come, claiming pretty much the opposite of the established science. And one organization, the Heartland Institute, is maybe the best known in the campaigns of promoting climate denial. And of course, at the same time, we know this is not just one individual organization. They're not alone. They are actually part of larger global networks. Diane Stone mentioned the trickiness and the difficulties in studying think tank networks. And I want to convince you that there are not only difficulties in studying these networks that are very messy, that there are also opportunities, because we can do something which is hard to do. We can look at the interlinkages between interests and ideas. So the question really is that we are after is, what role does the Atlas Network, which has been recognized as a major network that is home to many climate obstruction think tanks around the world, not only in the United States. So what role does such a think tank network and its umbrella organization, Atlas Network, play in the global climate policy field? Because the question is not trivial. Climate denial is not all. There's many other strategies. This is not the only group of think tanks. Lots of think tanks that support green capitalism, clean technology, and so on and so forth. So what do they do? For the sake of time, I mention only here some of the theoretical literature that is important for us scholars. And I point out here that the method here is a pretty large multi-site case study, because our group of think tanks amounts to 546 organizations we did survey, and which need closer investigation. And we also tried to collect the content on climate policy, which amounted to 23,000 articles written by more than, actually we know about 4,000 authors about. This is just to acknowledge quickly my team. Our team, Ruth McKee from De Montfort and I, we are heading this global survey group. And so this is certainly not my own work only. Bear with me for a short introduction into the Atlas Network overall. So many people have heard of it, but few know really what it is. To then go to the climate sort of a content area and end with some conclusions. The relaxing picture of this man is the founder of the Institute of Economic Affairs in the UK. The artist Andreas Sigman presented him as a person on wheels, because he was basically the most active founder of think tanks. After the Institute of Economic Affairs, he actually helped setting up think tanks in countries far as Canada, Fraser Institute, Peru, De Soto's Institute, Canada. So personally, together with, of course, colleagues and friends, he was an industrialist, an agro-industrialist, Buxted Chickens, and with other entrepreneurs, he set up think tanks and helped to spread the idea that you need policy think tanks that promote a free market message. And the mission of Atlas has been nicely expressed by John Blundell, the president of the Atlas Economic Research Foundation. He mentioned that the mission of Atlas is to litter the world with free market think tanks. Well, if they littered the world, let's scan the world for the result. If we do that, we see that the Atlas network is indeed global, with the strongest representation in North America and the United States in particular, and then followed by Europe and Latin America, a bit weaker in Africa, MENA region, and in Asia Pacific. These are their 5 different regions in which they coordinate activities. And it's notable here that Latin America is actually quite a bit stronger than other southern regions, which raises interesting questions. Why Latin America? We cannot go into, but we can talk about it later. The capacity, of course, here is not evenly distributed, so it's globalization, but uneven globalization as we used to know it. Maybe it's better sometimes to visualize something that happened over time. Before Atlas was founded, many of these think tanks were already set up, and each dot, we know the founding dates of these think tanks, and we know when they entered the Atlas network. And this is the way in which the Atlas network globalized. So we have basically maybe a slightly better idea that how sort of like over time there was a dense network of think tanks emerging and then formally organized in the Atlas space, very impressively strong in North America, in Europe, somewhat less dense in other areas, but you get an idea. If we talk about global civil society and the right side of the global civil society, we can observe Atlas as one element of the global civil society formation from a neoliberal, pro-free market and social conservative perspective. We used to talk only about the NGOs on the progressive side. Here we talk about the other side. The capacity of these think tanks is unevenly distributed. We see that some are very board heavy, so they don't have so many staff members. Others have more staff members, but the board members are particularly interesting. Totally, we talk about 23,000 people in the time period. This is possibly one of the most important aspects. Looking at the board members, we can see from which sectors they come. And we see that the largest share of board members comes from the private sector, including, of course, the energy companies, but from many, many other areas, including also consulting, law, and so on. Then another sector for us academics, very important, academia. Many board members of these think tanks come from academia and from other civil society organizations. Actually, very impressive how the network is organized across think tanks. Just because we are academics, I couldn't but show you the universities that are the strongest representation. George Mason University with more than 100 people linked up there. And the red colored are non-American universities. So you see a lot of Latin American, European universities as well. And it's notable that there are actually a number of Catholic universities, which raises maybe a few questions in this regard. The economic disciplines, I should also mention that it looks like the strongest representation of professors on these think tank boards is from economics. So this is another maybe important aspect in the discussion. Funding, we heard a bit about the funding of the trade associations. We have been able for the US, we always know much more about the US because simply so far the IRS data is available. And here we have found that 2.3 billion were paid to a total of to a number of organizations, of which 79 Atlas think tanks received more than 90%. So about 2 billion in this time frame went to 79 Atlas organizations in the United States, including the picture here shows American Enterprise Institute receiving 300 million, Heritage Cato. The Heartland Institute received 42 million in this period from these foundations. We can also look at international funding. The John Templeton Foundation, 45 million, is one foundation that shows us numbers, but the bigger numbers come from the Donors Capital Fund and Donors Trust. We don't see anymore the funding of these think tanks by Exxon and other oil corporations so much, because much of the money goes into these dark money machines. Templeton Funds International, here's a list of payments to Guatemala's Marroquin University, many European organizations. And so this is basically, unfortunately, just the tip of the iceberg of what we know, because we can study American foundation data. We have foundations in Europe, we have foundations in Latin America. We have not really data for that. So one challenge is to actually do similar research in places where we have to use other methods. And this is another important dimension. On a global scale, these think tanks are linked by board members. So they are not operating in isolation under the umbrella. They actually have people who share board membership, so they basically can be involved in coordinating activities. We see a lot of interlocks between North America, Western Europe, North America, Latin America, and then a little bit weaker in to Australia and Africa, MENA. But it's important to understand that these are not people who are working in isolation. They are global. Switching fast to the climate area, it is not the whole Atlas network that is involved in climate policy. So of the 446 organizations, 236 actually had climate content. So we were able to establish that they were publishing on this in this area. And the cake diagram you see here, the pie diagram you see here shows you that the vast majority of content is in North America. That is US and Canada. And Europe is the next biggest, and then Latin America, smaller shares in the other regions. That's actually in itself also interesting. Where is stuff published on this topic? Of course, there where you have a lot of contestation, and the contestation is then leading to a high level of production. The other diagram shows you that we coded the vast majority of material as obstruction-oriented narratives like policy skepticism, narratives like alternative solutions, whatever is proposed is not good, so we always need something different. Other narrative, typical defense of fossil lifestyle, fossil industry for job markets and so on, and also attacks against the organizations and the people who advocate climate policy. So that was the vast majority. Contrary to what people think, climate denial in these think tanks, yes, the share declines, but it does not go away. And we can expect with the dropping of the sort of like guarding of the internet that Trump has started now, we may see actually a revival, because some of the content kind of negotiations was in the climate field. And if that's not done anymore, and we see there is a limited amount of also affirmative content in some countries. Even neoliberal think tanks seem to think it's a good idea to do something about climate. You're familiar with the map. This is a map which shows you which think tanks produce climate content, the yellow ones, and how much. They get darker. And so it also, again, confirms the idea that it's in the theaters of North America and Europe mostly where the strongest content production takes place. We can use this data to actually see closer which think tanks hang together in which ways, what they kind of share, like board memberships. In Brazil, for example, only Brazilian board memberships shared, whereas the Heartland Institute and the Institute of in the United States and the Institute of Economic Affairs in the UK have many shared board members, so we can expect them to coordinate their activities. We see that many institutes also share representation in universities. So people from the Heartland Institute on the board of Heartland and on the board of the Institute of Economic Affairs have people on these very many different universities. We can, of course, try to look closer and understand what kind of work do these people do. We also have looked at the author network of, so the author network means they share material across the world in think tanks. And so this again can be done. And if you combine all these different elements, you see sort of like different ways in which networks are connected. This is just like one small sort of like element of the global picture you can get. I wanted to point out that climate content distribution slightly differs. In North America, you see here this very large share of obstruction, 77%. For contrast, in Latin America, there was actually quite a bit more affirmative contrast. So even the Atlas network is not homogeneous, even if the major dominant force obviously is in the counter movement. We can also use the data to go in more detail in sort of like the individual output. We can see that which sort of like controversies get which NGOs and which individuals attacked. Al Gore among the individuals, Greta Thunberg, of course, then of course organizations like Greenpeace. And of course you can use the articles, we will publish them actually, we will publish the URLs, you can use them to go deeper and understand why there are some of these curves. Same for fossil defense, you see that the major concern that is brought out is fossil is good for jobs. Natural gas is very high on the defense of fossil for all kinds of reasons, like a bridge technology, allegedly. Policy, we see that bureaucracy is one of the major themes in attacking climate policy. We see that a lot of activities are directed against the global climate governance, against the IPCC, against Paris. So these are opportunities. One more thing, if you bear with me for one moment, I will show you two strategies that are really relevant that think tanks have been promoting across the world. On the one hand, the denial activities that are again here represented by the think tanks co-sponsoring the Heartland conferences. And among the think tanks that co-sponsored the Heartland climate conferences featuring many denial activists were the Atlas Network itself. So the Atlas Network as an umbrella organization was involved in the organization of global climate denial conferences. In Europe, they funded parallel to the US conferences, another set of climate conferences organized by Atlas member Institut für Unternehmerische Freiheit in Germany and EIKE. So basically kind of copying the pattern from the United States to demonstrate it's basically a legitimate discussion both in North America and in Europe. And one case study we have published, so you can read, I will just mention it briefly, is the campaign against green jobs. You might remember, many of you, the time of the global financial crisis when, of course, labor market concerns were huge, but climate concerns were also huge. And so the talk about the double dividends, the promise of investing in renewables, not only for climate mitigation, but also for job creation was big. And President Obama, in his campaign to create 5 million new jobs, relied on Germany, Spain, Denmark as examples for successful energy conversion. Now, what does the counter movement do? You need to destroy the narrative. So they solicited studies from within the network, from Spain, from Germany, from Denmark, to dispute the claim that there are green jobs and basically, calculate job loss as a result of climate investment, and so destroy the narrative of there is a double dividend. And in the United States, it was successful to the extent that President Obama in the campaign dropped mentioning the examples of Spain and Germany. And we also looked how these studies that were solicited in Europe were actually also picked up by the right-wing media, mostly in Europe, and actually created the same narrative, leading both in Germany and in Spain to basically a block on the renewable investment trajectory for a few years and change in the policy instruments. And so one might say that the capacities they can sort of like find within the network and the capacity to relate it to media were quite successful. Similar case studies can be done in branding climate activists as climate terrorists, because that's also a feature in these networks. To get involved in the debates on indigenous rights is another important feature. So we believe there are many, many case studies that are still waiting to be done based on such material. I just mentioned this and can now come quickly to the conclusion. So the answer to the question is yes. The Atlas think tank network definitely is critically involved in organizing climate counter movement activities, both the network as a larger group of think tanks and the umbrella organization. For the time period we studied, I shall say, between 2000 and 2022. Anything later, we need to still ascertain. You cannot easily study them now because they took all the information from the internet, so it's a bit more limited what we can do now. We see that in terms of output, yes, denial declines relatively. Other narratives gain in importance, but that needs not to be stable. So we need to see what are the next strategies. When Eduardo mentioned climate realism being the sort of like new normal in the debate, that was exactly vocabulary used by neoliberal think tanks that were promoting climate denial and climate policy critiques against the so-called alarmists. Everybody who was raising concerns was an alarmist, and the people who, on their side, were self-representing themselves as climate realists. If Eduardo is right, that this is the new normal, then they have made a huge inroad into the mainstream discourse. So on the not-to-do list, we should not only think about to-do lists. On the not-to-do list, we need to put the ability to hide funding information. We need much better information on who is actually getting involved in policy networks, in policy publications, and so on and so forth. We have so far good information for the US. We know quite a bit about funding there. We know nearly nothing about many other countries, and that's a huge restriction in discussing who is actually doing what. And we need to discuss with our colleagues who are on boards of climate think tanks that deny the science why, as a scientist, you should be on such a board, I believe. This should be not a normal activity for an academic who is in good standing at a university to be also part of an organization that is clearly undermining scientific standards. On the to-do lists, we need to find out more about the links of the fossil corporations and the interest groups that were mentioned, and some of their service agents, namely the many financial and legal companies that are populating these networks. We have many more finance firms on boards of Atlas think tanks than energy firms. And we have many more law firms than energy firms. And of course, this can simply be because they're represented to some extent. We also should discuss more in a systematic way, the links between think tanks as producers of input for media and the media circulating these messages. And of course, desperately, we need much, much deeper investigation into the discourse coalitions and narratives of the various climate obstruction strategies that require much deeper contextualized thinking about this information. Our effort was basically to maybe show you some of the dimensions of the structural conditions of obstruction discourses, and now the next job is to go deep and study in many cases, in case studies in more detail, what's actually going on. Thank you very much.
During 3 days, I'm walking around, and a lot of people approach me. They know that I'm part of the local host, and they ask the same question. Everyone asks the same question. I'm already here in Thailand. I'm already here in Chiang Mai. I want to see the elephant. I think you guys see a lot of elephants today. Just a very bad joke. Okay, so we need a few more questions from you guys. We have 2 platforms. Of course, you can raise your hand the conventional way, and another way is to use the digital platform. So feel free to typing the question that you want to ask. We also have the opportunity to, speak it out in case you want to raise a very long question or reflect on the empirical evidence that our panelists share to you guys. So who's gonna start? Okay. Okay, so you can start. Yep.
Hi everyone, that was fascinating, kind of depressing as well, but fascinating nonetheless. So my question is, so since political power, economic power, and ideational power are all clearly in favor of climate obstruction now globally. What can possibly undo this seemingly insurmountable obstruction? Are we now relying on increasingly devastating natural disasters and major destruction for change? Or is even that not going to be enough?
Okay, I'm gonna collect, let's say 2-3 more questions, and then we can go back to the panelists. Jennifer?
Hi.
Jennifer.
Oh, not Jennifer. I'm not Jennifer. Hang on. Who am I looking for? Sorry.
I want to add
Yes,
to
Jen.
the comment that was just made, because each of you have very different policy proposals that you would suggest we act on, or proposals for more research and clarity on what's actually happening. So I think one of the main difficulties we face is actually coming together. You can't hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay. So you each had very different proposals for the actions we should take to address climate change. And I think this is reflected also in the groups that are trying to take action, social action, activists, lobbyists, whatever, even politicians and policymakers. We all have very different ideas about what exactly the problem is and what we should do about it, and we can see this reflected in the panelists' comments today. So my question is, given the urgency of the situation and the direness of the problem, how can we come together to actually make agreements about where we should focus our attention and what we should do? I'm thinking about this very much in terms of not just a researcher, but a citizen who wants to see things done. And how can I focus my energies and that of others to actually do something that will have an impact? Thanks.
Hi, my name's Patrick. I'm not Jennifer. I had the same point. I loved the presentations. They're great. I just think I'm constantly asking, where's the counter narrative, and where's the counter institutional dynamics that we need to start developing to make action happen, rather than in the face of this constant barrage of the stuff you were talking about.
Iwa?
Thank you. Yeah, fascinating and depressing. I was wondering, are there made any analysis of who is, if there are any networks who are countering the countering some way?
And the final one? Any additional? Yes, please.
Leif Kalev, Tallinn University, Estonia. You made very interesting presentations from, I would say, politics perspective. So it's, let's say, big fights about climate change as such and what should be done about it. But of course we have several perspectives in public policy, and some are also more peaceful. So my own research is much also related to policy design, policy development. We know there are different ways to address problems, also different logics of solution, different measures, measure mixes. And probably there are different ways to combat climate change. How could this feed into the discussion in the context of such, let's say, polarized debates? Do you have some thoughts also along these lines? Thank you.
Okay, this is for the first round. We can have the second round. Who want to start? The microphone is in your desk.
Sure. Well, yeah, thank you. Great group of questions. On the first question about, will natural disasters help perhaps to, shift the mood? The existing political science literature is pretty depressing on that front as well. So there's been some great studies done where they've compared polling before and after natural disasters and seen whether that's changed the views on climate change. And sadly, what those studies show is concern about climate change goes up quite a bit in the days and weeks after a natural disaster. But if you take the same poll 3 months later, concern about climate change is at the same level pre-disaster. So I'm not especially hopeful that climate disasters will actually shift the dial in the long term. But as far as what we can do, I mean, I don't have great answers for this, right? And what we can do as individuals, I mean, I think it depends where you live and your expertise. You know, in some jurisdictions, those with legal expertise, legal avenues are proving reasonably fruitful right now. There's lots of very useful public litigation going on trying to prevent new coal mines, new gas plants, etc. Those of us in the research space, you know, doing work trying to expose these types of activities, and others just organising local groups and local organising groups that are shifting political races and so on. But I don't think, you know, there's one silver bullet, and there's probably others in the room that have better answers on that front. But to the woman's question about, you know, what organisations, I think on my last slide there, we listed in the book, in the final chapters, we go through and identify a whole range of organisations that are pushing back on this issue. There's some great organisations in the media space. So for example, public relations professionals have organised their own organisations trying to pressure other people in their industry not to do work for these companies. We know that there's various networks in the legal community saying that that lawyers and others are refusing to do work. So in different professional networks there is pushback, but clearly a lot more to be done.
Okay, this is probably one of the most difficult moments for talking about what can we do for mitigating climate change, for avoiding the more terrible consequences of climate change, because we are in a this is a message I would like to convey. The questions were similar in some way. That is, the democratic recession is deep today, and particularly because of the United States. Okay, so the survival of democracy is at stake, and the environmental policy and climate policy, we are born in democratic countries, in democratic conditions that had possibilities of citizens to organize and to contest power. And the scientific community was also key, okay? So today we have the strengthening in the world of autocratic powers, okay? Some completely anti-climate, like Saudi Arabia, Russia. Others ambivalent today, very negative in the past, like China, okay? And in the democratic world, we have a wave of conservative movements, a backlash. So my view, the most important things we need to do for working in favor of retaking the wave of movements in favor of mitigating climate change and sustainable development is to reverse democratic recession. This is not an easy task, okay? And it's a very depressive year today. I can't tell you something better than this. Last year, maybe, I could tell, no, okay, let's hope that Democratic Party will win the election in the United States. But today, the situation is very, very difficult, okay? So this is my main message, repeating. Most important thing is what will happen in the United States in 2026 and 2028. This is the most important thing for the future of the earth and climate, okay? But also in other countries important, like the European countries, or in Latin America, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, and so on.
Maybe I don't have to say much after this, but let me say that when Frank Fischer introduced the panel and talked about how in some areas people believed we need authoritarian government to solve the ecological crisis, that was basically a big fear that the climate crisis would be taken as a pretense to basically remove or move towards technocratic authoritarian government. Now we see actually the two things hang together, defending democracy and sort of like promoting aggressive climate action are two and the same things, because authoritarian mechanisms are used to repress climate policy. So it's exactly the opposite. The authoritarian structures that we see and face are actually in place and more to prevent coordinated global climate policy making. So we need to actually not think of the two things as two different struggles. The struggle for democracy, you know, activist, civil activism and climate mitigation is actually, I think, one and the same. Because we can, of course, also only hope that we can generate the solidarity we need for sort of like a good climate policy if people are actually doing it in a bottom-up way rather than in any technocratic fashion. I would like also, I mean, we always are very fast to say, oh, these huge movements, these huge structures, and we are feeling completely overwhelmed. And so what do we do? Is there something that can be done? Well, for example, even in the simple world of research, and in the many countries where we come from, in most countries, we do not know nearly as much about these sort of like policy networks and obstruction forces and finances as we know for the United States. I'm missing that actually in many countries, people go for the corporate foundations that fund right-wing think tanks there. You know, there may be other strategies necessary than looking at text documents of the government. We may have to do other strategies, but we need to know more about the 30, 40 foundations we have in Latin America, funding these organizations, about the 30, 40 foundations we have in Europe. We need to know more what the Friedrich-Naumann-Stiftung from Germany does around the world to fund many of these organizations, what the Spanish organization FIL, Aznar's former Prime Minister Aznar's group, what they are doing in Latin America. There is actually still a world of research that is necessary to advance the picture of the animal in a room. Indeed, to this day, we know many things about the United States. We know many things not about many other countries that are important to know if we want to know whom do we have to address and what do we have to do.
Dieter, there's the question, point directly to you. How do the results of your work unveil the relationship between interests and ideas?
That's a great question. I mean, obviously, the effort in which we are involved here is suggesting that to meaningfully discuss, negotiate the relationship between interests and ideas, we have nowadays to sort of like go global, at least in this policy area. You know, it's a globalized policy field. It's very sort of like many actors are multinational actors, corporations, some of these corporate foundations, the governments, the international institutions, and so the interplay between interests and ideas is notoriously difficult to study. And I mean, we know that there is no determinism. There are oil companies that support, you know, think tanks that promote green capitalist messages. We know from the research that actually in Canada, all the big Canadian banks that were part of the Canadian members of the Atlas networks actually quit these organizations and moved into think tanks that promote green capitalism messages. That's one of the nice things about such data, that you can observe sort of like possible strategic shifts. You know, and so does it mean now that the financial capital interests of the Canadian big banks, that they are now, you know, moving straight forward into a very progressive climate mitigation strategy? I don't know. That, you know, again, is much more subject to a much closer study, because we need then to understand what kind of strategies are in this field of clean tech, clean capitalism, what kind of strategies are promoted. So the answer is not very satisfying. I mean, there's no short way out. Interests exist, but they need to be interpreted, and that's why we cannot reduce any analysis to just, you know, counting the corporations, counting the foundations. We need to engage the way in which the interpretation works and the social constructions that all these actors do. And that's basically why the think tanks are interesting, because here we see at least sort of like the coming together of the world of ideas and interests.
Yes, I have a question. It is clearly the case, as Christian pointed out, that the literature on disaster is not very promising insofar as waking people up. But I'm wondering if this is a more, or say, a shorter term phenomenon. I do think that the people who lose their houses to wildfires and things like this are much more aware of what's going on. But what happens when we hit 3 or 4 degrees of centigrade, a disastrous situation, an unlivable situation? I think that people might actually become more politically active. Now, this is somewhat depressing insofar as we don't want to have to wait to 3 or 4% for people to respond. And to some degree, or to a large degree, it will be much more difficult to respond. Yeah, that's my question. I don't have the answer to that, but I think it's something to think about.
We can pick some question in the skin, and I think actually the first one very relevant to you, especially the point that do you see any connection between the climate obstruction and the neo-colonialism? Eduardo, yeah?
Could you repeat
the first question? But maybe you can highlight on the relation between climate obstruction and the neo-colonialism. Do you see any connection?
Okay, well, this is a very general question. I mean, okay, of course, climate obstruction is a lot related to neoliberalism, though not the whole we are today in a movement that is different from neoliberal. That is, neoliberal was the movement predominant in the 90s, 20s, and 2010s. Today, we are in a time of growing state intervention, nationalism, nativism, and so undermining the fundamentals of neoliberalism, neoliberal economic policy. Okay, but not, let's say, the neoliberal wave brought together obstructionalism, denialism, but also brought together green capitalism, let's say. So it was ambivalent, contradictory, okay? Neocolonialism. This is something that some countries, some movements historically in the since the climate issue emerged in the world, particularly in India, for example, had emphasized that the climate colonialism was a new form of colonialism, okay? So the policies in favor of mitigating climate change were a form of neocolonialism. This is one lecture about the relations in between this was the lecture in which neocolonialists climate change policies were neocolonials, imposing to developing countries to avoid that they reach prosperity, for example, or they reach fast economic growth, okay? I wouldn't see today that the movement of obstruction is directly related to a form of neocolonialism. I hadn't thought enough about this, but this is my first. So, global class war, well, I don't think this exists, okay? We live in a society that is extremely complex, where there is a significant complexification of class structure. We can still talk about class structure, but was something very, very different of the idea in which, when the time of particularly Marxist approach about class war, okay? So even today, the amount of differentiations that we need to observe in movements, how societies are divided, fractured, how coalitions, political coalitions, permanently redefine itself. So it's the opposite of a category that is extremely simplistic, like global class war, or other one, the idea of dividing the world in developing countries and developed countries. This is an obstacle, an epistemological obstacle today. This is used still by the United Nations and the Convention, but today, at least we need to differentiate the world in four types of countries: high-income countries, middle-income countries, high middle-income countries, low middle-income countries, and low-income countries. The difference between high middle-income countries like Brazil or China are with low-income countries is bigger than there is the difference between high middle-income countries and high-income countries. So complexity is the mantra today, in my view.
Any question here that you want to address? Christian? If not, we can go for the second round. Okay, so we still have time for the second round. I think Charlotte first. Yeah. Charlotte.
Thank you very much for the presentations. I want to challenge a little bit the assumptions at the beginning of the talk, about what were the factors that sort of turned the shift towards climate obstruction, and to question a little bit what happened right before. So I come from a country, I come from France, where we had the massive movement, the Yellow Vest movement, before the period that we talked about in 2018 and 2019. And part of the driving factors for that, we understand and we know from the scholarship work that has been done about it, has to do with the fact that part of the climate action policies and environmental policies that were developed did not pay sufficiently attention to the social dimensions of things. And this was for the French case. But we know from other countries around the world that there has been some social justice claim and climate justice claims that were made for some time, and that in looking at how policies have accumulated over time in the field of environment and climate action, they built a different block of competences, capacities, resources, you name it, but did not necessarily include issues of development, issues of social issues, territorial justice, spatial justice, redistribution, equity, and so on. So I was wondering to what extent the period that we're in can also be thought as this process of accumulation not being able or not strengthening sufficiently coalition to support this massive change, and in not being able to reach out to those groups and offer an alternative offer an alternative in terms of development, in terms of well-being, in terms of how those communities could develop in the future. So I want to play a little bit the devil's advocate with this question. I'm not necessarily saying I disagree with everything that you do. I recognize there is a big elephant and lots of them in the room, and I agree with that. But on the other hand, we also know from scholarship and environmental and climate action that maybe what was done before wasn't enough in the field of climate action, and that some big blind spots have been going on, and maybe account also for the situation that we know today.
We can get only 2 more, so it's going to be you and over there, and maybe end with Aura. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Sharon Friel from the Australian National University. 3 questions. One follows on from that lady's remarks of fundamentally at the core of climate obstruction and the lack of action on climate mitigation, it strikes me, is social and economic inequality. And so a question of how in the examination of climate obstruction to bring those dimensions into it more. The second is around, so Christian, I should have said that was outstanding, that whole panel was outstanding. But you pointed towards those other actors, so including agriculture, for example. And so I was thinking, again, some of the remarks from the floor of how do we make change happen, and how do we make change happen quickly? We cannot wait till we get to 3 or 4 degrees. We're basically, we're not here anymore at that point. And so that leads me to the question of how to build those coalitions with unusual bedfellows. So groups like those foundations that are absolutely at play in exactly the same way with the anti-gender movement right now. The same groups that are at play around inequality per se. The same groups that exist within the world of the commercial determinants of health, an area that I work in. And then some of those unusual bedfellows that exist within the social movements of the food movements, so La Via Campesina, for example. How do we build those coalitions as a way of overcoming some of the incredible power inequities that you've all pointed to? And then finally, absolutely, there is an opportunity for all of the sorts of research that you've just described, Rita, and that was just beautiful. But I suppose I would also encourage us to think in our research of, in addition to the expose of these problems, is what are the conditions that enable change to happen, particularly given the urgency in which action needs to happen. We cannot just describe these problems. We have to, as researchers, we have to examine what works, where it works, why it works, how it works.
I'm so sorry, we have insufficient time to add the questions. You guys need to wrap up and reflect and maybe answer some question that you think you can. Please, maybe 2 minutes each, but we have only 5 minutes.
Very short. Very quickly then. Great questions, and to the question of the yellow vest and the blind spots in the old movement. Well, I mean, one of the successes of neoliberals, both of the Atlas Network and in other places, was of course to push climate policy making ever more in the space of economic policy, economic approaches like carbon pricing. And basically, we all know that the promise was always, yes, we need to price carbon, and then we need to refinance the cost of the sort of like people who are less well off. And that never happened. And so what we see now is we see that policies have moved very much in this field of economic climate policy making rather than exploiting the whole range of opportunities. And it has arrived at this critical juncture where basically people who are poor are rebelling against, of course, the increase of living. And I think it's one of the fallacies of the neoliberal environmental economics discourse that every problem in climate policy can be solved by way of carbon pricing, without actually explaining how the social compensation, how the redistribution that is necessary can happen. Now, if you saw the number of economists on these think tank boards, and if you see the advance of economists in IPCC, people like William Nordhaus, that basically economic obstruction influence, the world's best temperature, Nordhaus calculated is 3.7 degrees, against all evidence of climate sciences. Now, I think we need to cut back on the role of economics in environmental policy making, and we need to find out how to enable redistribution so that people can bear the price. So that's one definite, absolute necessary element, because otherwise there's not going to be the coalition building. And on the what we can do, what works and what doesn't work, well, we can take a page from the neoliberal networks. If you do entertain global networks of think tanks, then you can actually learn about what's going on in Canada and what worked in Canada to obstruct climate action. And the other way around, we should also have these networks to enable to learn from all the different places what works there. So what I challenge all of us is become as well organized as the neoliberals.
Yeah, thank you so much for the questions. Picking up your point, I feel like there's a big debate in the climate movement that kind of hasn't been reconciled yet. On the one hand, there's a view that the climate movement needs to deal with energy justice issues and have a just transition and needs to solve poverty and inequality. But on the other hand, there's a push that, well, you can't expect the climate movement to solve every societal problem. And so I don't think that question, that tension's been reconciled. But I think one way to do it is to picking up on the points over here is to build allies, to being much better at building unusual bedfellows, so when you look at, I've spent a lot of time interviewing lobbyists and trying to understand the corporate playbooks in this space, and what those that oppose climate action are very good at is building coalitions with folks they might not always like or even work with. And I think on the other side of the equation, building cross-societal, for want of a better term, social movements that bring together the folk working on inequality or poverty or energy or climate change, and building those types of coalitions that we don't yet have. I think those that are pushing for progressive social policies are still very much working to some extent in silos. So if we could see those kind of societal-wide coalitions that perhaps we've seen at other points in history, we might be able to get the movement happening more quickly. I mean, the only other point to make is we still don't have great studies of what types of strategies work effectively under what conditions, in part because it's very hard to do that work, but that is, I think, an urgent task as well.
Maybe in democracies, when they are working okay, and right now most of the democracies in the world are not working okay, some of them extremely deteriorated. In democracies, there is real possibility of integrating social policies with climate policy. Actually, this is something that is relatively easy to convey in democratic societies. But the problem now is that we are living in extremely difficult situation. This year is the worst year in history, in the history of democracy at the times of climate change. This is something that we need to be strongly aware. I mean, the climate issue started in the second half of the 80s. The climate, not the environmental, okay? Environmental is wider. But the climate issue started in the second half, and since this was the years of the detente between Reagan and Gorbachev, and afterward was the end of the Cold War and the peace dividend that was not deep as many people imagine. And we were going in the direction of that a kind of climate policy is synonymous of the context of a post-Cold War era. But we are not anymore in the post-Cold War era. We are in the second Cold War, that can call other way, but in extremely conflicted era, okay? And so the conditions for working for climate are difficult. But in my view, first of all, is the key task of all of us, and particularly in the scientific community, because science is a lot dependent of democracy, is to try to revive democracy, to try to defend democracy against the possibility of destruction, okay? And this is much more important, the fight for democracy, than the fight for mitigating climate change. This is I have my more than 30 years of my life working with climate policy, but also with democracy. And now is the most extreme year, the most difficult year in the whole history I have experienced. And I have experienced this since the middle 80s.
Okay, if I'm going to make the concluding remark, maybe just 1 or 2 minutes. I hope it's okay.
I don't have any conclusion here as such. I would say that this is an enormous challenge for social science and public policy. Our job is to help people make sense of the situation they're in, and these 3 presentations have done a brilliant job toward elucidating factors that are relatively hidden, but absolutely essential to understanding the politics that's going on. I would only add one additional point. If democracy is important, which I think it is, there is another, I don't want to say elephant in the room, that we need to address front on, and that is the distribution of wealth. Democracy cannot do this given the kinds of distribution of wealth that we have. It will be very difficult. And I would add one more topic. If we were doing this panel again, I might suggest that we have somebody speak about the consequences of war. The studies show that the war in Ukraine or against Ukraine causes more CO2 output than most countries of the world. But we don't talk about this. It's off the agenda. These groups keep it off the agenda. This cannot be the end of this discussion. But Pia Pong and I thank the 3 of you for really brilliant presentations. Thank you.